Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Eric Thompson. I'm a Vice President and the Director of the Strategy, Policy, Plans, and Programs Division at CNA. On behalf of our President and CEO, Catherine McGrady, I'd like to welcome you to this virtual National Security Seminar event, which is the first of this year's series. Before we begin, and as several of you are still logging on, a couple of administrative notes. Today's event is unclassified and on the record. A recording of today's event will be available on our site in just a couple of days if you'd like to review it or share it with any colleagues who couldn't join us today. Today's event will be a moderated discussion. We'll jump right into the discussion in just a couple of minutes after I introduce the speakers. We'll give them a couple of moments to address some overarching framing questions about DBE and what to do about it. And then there'll be opportunities for the audience to ask questions. We definitely encourage you to send your questions in. If you are participating through Zoom and through your computer, you can send questions to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you have dialed in via telephone, you can send your questions via email to cna_nss@cna.org, which is the same email address that sent you the dial-in information yesterday, so you can just reply to that. If this is your first acquaintance with CNA, we're a nonprofit research organization comprised of the Center for Naval Analyses and the Institute for Public Research. The Center for Naval Analysis is a federally funded research and development center for the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, but our work supports decision makers across the Defense Department and other U.S. government agencies as well. Our Institute for Public Research supports Homeland Security and infrastructure protection, public safety, public health preparedness and response, and emergency operations at all levels. The National Security Seminar Series is a CNA initiative to bring together thought leaders from across the U.S. government, academic and research institutions, the private sector, and U.S. partner nations to share their expertise, facilitate discussions, and contribute to an ongoing dialogue about issues affecting national security. The goal of the series is to raise critical questions facing national security decision makers, illuminate them from differing perspectives, and create an environment where these topics can be discussed at a professional level without the normal constraints we face in our day jobs. The theme of this year's series is National Security in the Post-Pandemic World. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted almost every aspect of life in 2020, forcing us to reshape our relationships, rethink about the way we work and travel, and find new ways to connect and communicate and refine our sense of security. The pandemic has had similar implications for national security, affecting U.S. security partnerships, operations, logistics, and the health and safety of government and military personnel. These effects will likely to continue to resonate for years to come. In 2021, CNA's National Security Seminar Series will consider the ways in which the pandemic has reshaped the contours of the national security landscape and explore challenges the U.S. will face in a changed world. This series draws upon a wealth of expertise to spotlight emerging issues and altered trajectories that national security leaders will need to consider as they look to the future. Today's discussion will explore the challenges inherent in countering domestic violent extremism and possible ways forward for the new administration as they grapple with this challenge. The timing, optics, and symbolism of the Capitol attack on the 6th of January this year have raised public consciousness of domestic violent extremism to an extent not seen in decades. Even prior to January's events, the FBI and Department of Homeland Security have both made clear that domestic violent extremism is a pressing concern. Yet the national security conversation on this issue has been subdued compared to the attention and resources paid to countering foreign terrorist organizations since September 11, 2001. The current moment, however, will likely require a different toolkit than those developed to counter the terrorist threats of the past 2 decades. In this event, we'll examine the drivers and history of domestic violent extremism in America, the actions that could help counter it, those who need to be involved, and what steps should be taken now. Before we launch this conversation, let me briefly introduce our panelists for today. Tom Plofchan is a senior advisor at CNA's Institute for Public Research and a managing partner at Pangiam, a public-private partnership company. Over the course of the last decade, he has held roles across the U.S. national security sector focused on the intersections of technology, policy, civil liberties, and threat. As counterterrorism counselor to the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, he was tasked by the Secretary to coordinate the department's development and rollout of the 2019 Strategic Framework for Countering Terrorism and Targeted Violence, the first cabinet-level document to offer a strategy to combat domestic terrorism and racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism. Bill Rosenau is a senior policy historian at CNA and an expert in political violence, counterterrorism, and political warfare. He's the author of many articles and several books, including most recently, Tonight We Bombed the US Capitol, the explosive story of M19, America's first female terrorist group. He is also the host of CNA's Coming In From the Cold podcast series. Prior to joining CNA, Bill had several positions in government, including as a senior policy advisor in the Office of the Coordinator of Counterterrorism at the Department of State, a legislative assistant for defense and foreign policy in the US Senate, and special assistant to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict. Megan McBride is a research analyst at CNA's Center for Stability and Development. She also teaches courses on contemporary terrorism, political violence at Boston College, and is a fellow at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, where she contributes to a portfolio of countering violent extremist grants funded by DHS, the National Institutes of Justice, and NATO. Her recent work is focused on identifying and analyzing terrorist tactics in the information space, exploring how terrorists use violence and social media has evolved and adapted over time, analyzing state and non-state actors' use of the internet and online tools for propaganda and recruitment, and evaluating the efficacy of countering violent extremism and reintegration programming. I note that each of these panelists will be speaking in their own capacities as scholars, practitioners, and experts. Their opinions do not reflect those of CNA or our sponsors. With that, you've heard enough from me, so let's get right into the conversation. We'll start out with really discussing what it is we mean by domestic violent extremism. And for that, I'll turn it over to Tom to introduce what this topic is really all about. Tom?
Thanks, Eric. And up front, let me say thank you to yourself, to Doug, to Casey, and the whole CNA team for convening this NSS on this important topic at this timely moment. And I appreciate the opportunity to join Meg and Bill and yourself to have this conversation. So to your question, the truth is definitions in this space are hard to come by, particularly when we talk about the difference between the academic and the operational worlds. And I bring that up because there's a bit of an alphabet soup that people have probably heard as they start to learn more about this issue in recent months and recent years. You've probably heard people refer to domestic terrorism, domestic violent extremism, targeted violence, homegrown violent extremism, and perhaps even a variety of others. Sometimes people just say extremism, which has a very different connotation than violent extremism, and ultimately a very different operational law enforcement perspective as well. So let's talk about how we define DVE in the context of countering it ultimately and understanding the real causes of it first and foremost. So the important thing to note here is the violent term within the larger phrase. So our conversation today, as we've discussed, is going to focus primarily on domestic violent extremism rather than that more large social conversation around extremism as a whole. In particular, that violent term is a good place to highlight that we're talking about the larger context of terrorism. So let me give a few quick definitions that will start us here and pull us all the way down into DVE specifically. Now, as I'm sure many on the line, know well, terrorism is defined in this case in the Code of Federal Regulation as the unlawful use of force and violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, civilian population, a segment thereof, in furtherance, of political or social objectives. Domestic terrorism is defined by Title 18 of the U.S. Code, primarily relating to events that occur within U.S. territorial jurisdiction and acts that are dangerous to human life and a violation of criminal laws of the United States. And B, that intend or appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. So what we've talked here so far about is the framework of violence that defines terrorism. When we start talking about DVE, domestic violent extremism, we're talking about the ideologies or a bucket of ideologies and motivation in that domestic context. And so there are really two things to think about. There's DVE, and then there's the flip side of the coin, which is homegrown violent extremism, or HVE, which I'll just very briefly describe so that we can focus appropriately on DVE for this conversation. So again, definitions and terminology in this space has not been explored and fully resourced and studied quite in the same way. We haven't come across the continuity of language and precision of language that we need to in this space, and that creates complications. But generally understanding HVE, homegrown violent extremism, is effectively a person, or a homegrown violent extremist is effectively a person who lives and operates primarily in the United States, who commits or plans or finances terrorist acts against domestic US targets while ideologically motivated by political or social objectives that are inherently foreign, usually inspired by a foreign terrorist organization, but not directed by that foreign terrorist organization. The flip side of the coin, and the focus of our conversation today, and in particular, recent months and weeks, as we all know, or months and years, pardon me, as we all know, is DVE. And so DVE is effectively a domestic violent extremist, pardon me, is effectively an American person, or a person who's been residing here, who commits acts of terrorism inspired by ideologies that are inherently domestic in nature, i.e., they are not specifically foreign. Now, it's important to note for our conversation that DVE is inherently influenced and shaped by foreign influence. There's a whole conversation to be had about psychological warfare, some of our nation state adversaries, and others who are shaping this conversation. But the key takeaway is that DVE is effectively domestic terrorism committed by Americans against Americans, based on inherently domestic issues, oftentimes very long-held issues that haven't been resolved for many years. The most lethal of these is racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism. Without a doubt, within that group, the most significant is violent white supremacy extremism. But the lethality and the attacks of other groups or other extremist ideologies, from anti-fascist, poorly defined extremism, to anti-government, to environmental extremism, they're all on the rise, and they're a part of the conversation today in this construct of DVE.
Thanks, Tom. There's a lot going on there, and we'll spend some time unpacking this today. But I would let me just suggest that maybe Bill Rosenau can give us some historic perspective on violent extremism in the U.S. That might help us understand the issue and frame this conversation as we talk about what to do next. Bill?
Sure, Eric, thank you very much. It's great to be here with you all today, and thank you to Casey and Doug and everyone for organizing this very, very timely event. Domestic violent extremism has been part of the American political landscape for as long as we've had a political landscape. We can go back to the foundings of the nation. I think looking at the origins of let's say the Ku Klux Klan, I think would be I think the most relevant place to begin. The Ku Klux Klan, which went through at least 3 different cycles, the Reconstruction era, the 1920s and 1930s, and then with the growth of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. The Klan, without a doubt, is the most significant domestic violent extremist organization in American history. It is today, I wouldn't say it's a shadow of itself. It's morphed into other forms. It's increasingly embraced neo-Nazi ideology. So it's much less distinct. But the Klan certainly isn't alone. We had a wave of anarchist violence in the early 20th century. We had sort of ethno-nationalist violence involving Puerto Rican separatism, even Croatian independence movements, which were actually quite lethal. New left movements, the Weather Underground, and today, yeah, but there are linkages with the past that are quite obvious. Tom mentioned the white supremacists, and I would not disagree with him, but I would put white supremacists and the anti-government groups as the most important actors in this space, without a doubt. Again, there's overlap between these two. Certainly, I think most of the anti-government extremists are not white supremacists. They don't, and they're even Black and brown members of some of the anti-government groups. And white supremacists are less interested in, I think, the anti-government stance of groups like the Sovereign Citizens. So anyway, I think we've entered a new wave, if I may say, a new historical wave. Actually, you could go back to the 1970s, the 1980s, and 1990s, culminating in Oklahoma City in 1995. That was another kind of distinct period of domestic violent extremism. But you know, it's like malaria. Okay, it can be subdued, it can be treated, but it's kind of always there, and it reemerges periodically for reasons that Meg and Tom and I will be discussing.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate that. So with the sort of definitional background and some of the historic context, maybe I'll turn it over to Meg here, and maybe you can offer perspectives on what's driving the surge of DVE now, and what's behind this, and how should we understand why it's come to the fore at this time?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I'm gonna begin by sort of echoing what both Tom and Bill said, and thank Casey and Doug for making this happen. And I'm also really happy to be here with the three of you. I was just listening to what Tom and Bill were saying and some of the conversations about the alphabet soup, and some of the one of the things that I think is notable in this space when we talk about this topic is that the language has changed a lot over these decades. People in the KKK weren't referred to as terrorists. That was just not the sort of language that was used in that era. And that sort of language of terrorism became incredibly popular post 9/11. Now, that's not to say that language didn't exist prior to that. It certainly did, but I think we got into the lazy habit of sort of referring to Islamist extremists as terrorists, sort of all Islamist extremists as terrorists. We sort of blurred the line problematically between what it means to be an extremist and what it means to be a violent terrorist. And that's created a false sense of difference between the sort of dynamics that we saw playing out in the primarily in the Middle East, sort of in that culminated on 9/11, and then obviously sort of had lingering effects over the last 20 years, and what we're seeing happening today, right? We have this sort of false sense that these are different things and they're happening for fundamentally different reasons. But the reality is that both, I think, are sort of the same mechanisms of radicalization are at play, and they're both forms of sort of extremism endemic to specific ideological systems. So in the Middle East, that ideological system is Islam, and here in the United States, unfortunately, one of sort of the ideological systems that is sort of endemic to America is white supremacy and sort of far right extremism. So when we sort of ask ourselves, what are the drivers? In some ways, the drivers aren't particularly different. So perceived inequality, which in the United States, I think is taking the form of a conversation about income inequality, loss of faith of government, erosion of trust in authorities. All of these things are at play. And so when we see radicalization happening, I think really what we're seeing is kind of a three-part process. There's a cognitive opening that's met with an ideology and amplified and affirmed by a community. Right. And so in the United States, I think the cognitive opening, there's been a sort of a series of issues that have arisen. We had sort of an economic downturn from 2008 to 2012. I think that's roughly right. There have been major cultural shifts that have occurred in the past 10 years that have sort of created a sense of instability and uncertainty. There's been a lot of conversation about demographic changes that are creating senses of instability and uncertainty. And I think if we're sort of looking for a cognitive opening, it's impossible not to point the finger at COVID, right? Which has amplified feelings of insecurity, anxiety. It has left people economically devastated. It has destroyed people's plans sort of for the future, ruined small businesses. It's unquestionably sort of has created a sort of almost a national level, even a global level, you could say, sort of cognitive rupture that has created the space for this phenomenon we're seeing today. The second piece, right, ideology, is the sort of availability of, I'm actually I'll do what makes a ton of sense in a seminar like this and refer to William James, a late 19th century philosopher of religion, who obviously has a lot to sort of offer to this conversation, but James talked about a thing that he referred to as live religions, which is to say a religious idea that was sort of available to a people. So one way James might have said this in the current moment is to say that Mormonism is not a live religion in Mecca, and Islam is not a live religion in Salt Lake City, right? Which is to say that they're just not sort of ideologically familiar options that feel possible or that feel sort of ideologically akin or sort of religiously accessible. So one of the things you need in the wake of a cognitive opening is a live ideology, to kind of borrow James's language. And in the United States, that ideology, unsurprisingly, so I mean, one way to look at this is to say that in the Arab world, that ideology was radical Islamism, right? It was an Islamist ideology about the sort of combination of politics and religion. And in the United States, one form that has taken is far-right white supremacist ideologies, which have a long history here. And they're so entwined, as Bill mentioned, in sort of American culture that they're inextricable. They're incredibly live. And then the third piece you need, right? So you have cognitive opening, you have an ideology, you need a community. And this is one of the things that's actually really interesting that's happening right now. Over the last 15 years, some people have estimated that the timeline to radicalization has decreased from 18 months to 7 months. And part of that is as a result of the sort of accessibility of communities online. When you're sort of trying to build a community of like-minded people in the real world, it's actually quite difficult to find them. Some of these conversation topics might be difficult to broach, but online it's easier to find ideological kin, to sequester yourselves in echo chambers. So when we look at the current moment, I think honestly, there were a lot of sort of conversations, as one example, after January 6th. And one of the things that you heard regularly, sort of if you were on, I don't know, like terrorism expert Twitter, was a total lack of surprise at what had happened, right? That like, that there's sort of, if you look at sort of the path of the last 10 years or so, and you sort of were tracking these factors, these sort of cognitive openings and the rise in availability of certain ideologies and the sort of coalescing of communities online, it was a when, not an if kind of a question. And I think that's how we kind of find ourselves in the current moment, right? Many people knew we were going to get here. And people have been actually talking about this for quite some time, for years now, to include government officials. We're just undeniably here now.
Thanks, Meg, and joining the somewhat wonky conversation about academics. One of the things that I know in teaching about terrorism is that, you know, ideas are ideas, ideology is ideas that compel action. So Tom, let me bring you into this and let's talk about the radicalization process and that movement towards action and activity, and not just thinking things that may be counter to the prevailing political social order, but actually moving towards action.
Sure, thanks, Eric. And I'll just piggyback part of what Meg said and say that, you know, domestic violent extremism is, generally speaking, inherently motivated and inspired by a couple of very basic things: hate, ignorance, and frankly, in many cases, ego, inability or lack of desire to engage with people who come from a different perspective. So, you know, if you take that in context, and you take Meg's point about online communities, and your question in the context of rapidity of radicalization to violence, we find ourselves in a moment today where radicalization to violence, in this context, DVE in particular, is happening much faster, as Meg noted, than really any time in American history that we really understand from, you know, an academic standpoint, from what we have to study and understand, or draw conclusions from, I should say. And one of the key challenges of that is that law enforcement mechanisms are designed based off of the circumstances that they have seen previously. And so we live in a day today where, no matter the ideology, and I think it's important to note again that the ideologies of domestic violent extremism there's quite a large plurality of them in this country that have significant threats, not only from a lethal perspective, but also from an economic perspective or a free speech perspective. We find ourselves in a context where people are rapidly moving towards violence and our law enforcement doesn't have the mechanisms and the tools to respond. And I think that leads into what we do next, how we start to try to respond and who needs to be involved. But that is the key crux of a lot of the issue today, is that it's happening so fast that the traditional mechanisms don't allow us to prevent it in the first place.
Thanks.
Can I come in with something here, just to build on what Tom's been saying? One of the other things is I think we've lacked the political will. We have and I don't want to get too far ahead of the discussion, but there's something like 57 laws that might be considered applicable in the case of domestic terrorism. Okay, there's plenty of legislation in there. There's plenty in the U.S. code. What's lacked in the past has been the will, and it's very interesting to go back, way back to 1871 and the Grant administration, where Congress passed and Grant signed and took action upon the Ku Klux Klan Act. And basically through prosecutions, the use of the US military, agents that had been sent by predecessors to the FBI, went south and really disrupted and dismantled and effectively put into abeyance the Ku Klux Klan. And I think that there is no question that will that kind of will hasn't existed in recent years. We saw what happened in 2009 with the DHS analyst who wrote the report on returning veterans being susceptible to extremist ideologies, and how the Homeland Security Secretary disavowed that. And I think it's only recently that political will has been there, which is absolutely essential. We have the tools. I think we don't have all the knowledge, but and I'm sure we'll talk about this later. I think when we talk about civil liberties, I think a dangerous idea is we need some kind of new domestic terrorism law to tackle this problem, which I think is quite misguided.
Great, thanks. Hey, and just in terms of coordinating input into the conversation, which we warmly welcome. The reason we're having this conversation is to engage a broader community. I would just ask you to use the Q&A feature. It's at the bottom of the screen if you're on the Zoom, or the email to the email address that sent you your link if you're on the telephone. Feel free to use the chat. The chat's a great environment, but to make sure that your questions make it into the conversation, I'm going to be watching the Q&A box and teeing up those conversations for our panelists. So just mechanically, I encourage you to use Q&A. Chat feature is great, but when I tee up questions for the panelists, I'll be pulling them out of the Q&A box. So please use that if you'd like to engage directly, whether it's a question or a clarification or something you'd like the panelists to address. We were just getting to a part in the conversation of, hey, there's a lot going on and there's a lot of tools, and we have to think about what we're going to do and where we summon political will. Let's move on to sort of, what are the things we should be most concerned about when it comes to DVE, right? We have long traditions in this country about political dialogue and tolerance of views and free speech and whatnot. Let's talk about what are the things that the national security community should be, police, law enforcement should be thinking about and be most concerned about. I'm going to kick that over to Tom given his government service and DHS in particular, on how do we think about what are the things we should be focusing our concern on?
Sure, thanks, Eric. And I guess I'll frame that in two categories. So one, what are the concerns with the specific threat, and how do we respond to that threat? And then what are the concerns with our response, and how do we control our response and make sure that it's appropriate? So first and foremost, DHS in 2020 released their public State of the Homeland Threat Assessment, where they highlighted that lone offenders and small groups are the primary threats in the space that we're talking about in 2021. And so the size of the types of groups or individuals for committing these activities, i.e. this is not necessarily a coordinated 100, 1,000 people in one particular event sort of threat. plus the loose organization of individuals who might subscribe to some of the ideologies that inspire DVE. So again, there's no command and control structure in most cases that we're talking about. And then 3, the particular domestic context that we sit in, the fact that First Amendment rights mean that hateful, ugly speech is still not illegal, and that you need a criminal predicate in order to begin most traditional law enforcement activity. All of that adds up and is complemented by the rapidity of radicalization of violence that Meg mentioned earlier, to leave us with a situation that, as we mentioned, probably 5 or so minutes ago, makes law enforcement response extremely challenging. And to put a fine point on this, if someone is radicalizing in an online chat room that law enforcement doesn't really have a way of monitoring, much less consistently across the entirety of the internet, I should say, much less a criminal predicate or a justification for doing so because of free speech concerns, and someone goes from, as American as apple pie to radicalized to violence in 7 months, and they're doing it in a context that their local community and their local society isn't really aware of because it's happening in these online forums. The ways that we can prevent this, or that we have traditionally prevented these sorts of horrible acts, are very different than, say, the examples that Bill gave previously with the KKK, where you have a very different understanding kind of holistically about who's involved, who isn't, and then you have to address the problem head on, or in a more head on nature. So that's a kind of a summary: the size, the lack of organization, the civil liberties conversations, and the rapidity of radicalization, and what makes it so challenging in the current moment, and why it's so concerning. I think we could talk about all 4 of those. The other thing that I'd mention is there are concerns with response, and the reality of our war on terror is post 9/11, which was highly effective. The risk to the United States today from foreign-based terrorist organizations is significantly reduced. And part of the reason that we are able to turn our attention to this domestic conversation is because of the success of that program. And so as a national security professional, I highlight that up front. But one of the lessons learned is that we overstepped on civil liberties, we overstepped in profiling, and ultimately what that did is it radicalized other individuals, it reinforced extremist stereotypes, and it marginalized moderation. And we have a concern in the current moment, but also in DVE in general, because of the unique nature, the domestic nature of the conversation, to make sure that we move out on addressing this problem in a very nuanced and mature and seasoned way. And part of that involves appropriate CRCL, civil rights and civil liberties oversight, legal oversights, and reviews. But it also really focuses in on our social dialogue. And I'll make this point, and it's an odd one for a former CT professional to make, because it's not as nuanced or targeted. But the reality of terrorism is that it's inherently political. So when we're talking about terrorism or domestic violent extremism, as we talked about as a subset of domestic terrorism for the sake of the conversation, we're talking about an issue that is inherently involved with domestic politics. And as a result, we need to be very nuanced and very mature in our conversation about what is violent extremism and what is differing opinions. And that's important. And I bring up politics to say that's important that we do that as a whole of society, that we all talk through that issue and we figure out how as a society to engage on this in a constructive manner. The concern, to your specific question, if we don't, we start classifying any sort of political violence as on the right as white supremacy and on the left as Antifa. We further marginalize the moderates and we push the extremes to the far end. So our response here is very important, and making sure that it's nuanced and controlled is critical to ultimate, success and safety of any policy that we enact.
Thanks, Tom.
Can I jump in here, Eric?
Please go ahead, Meg.
So if I'm going to answer if I was to answer the question, what are the things we're concerned about? I'd say that there are 4 things that I'm concerned about. And one of those is one of the things that Tom just emphasized, right? Which is that we run a real risk of blurring the line between ideological extremists and violent extremists. And if we are not careful about that, we'll risk radicalizing to violence the ideological extremists. I think this is something, I mean, I might actually disagree with Tom a little bit. I'm not sure I would call our policies and activities in the quote unquote war on terror highly effective. I mean, they were highly effective at protecting the US homeland, but there are more terrorists today than there were on 9/11. ISIS is an output of the US war on terror. And I think that's sort of an important legacy to grapple with. It's a difficult legacy to recognize, and I think it's a particularly difficult thing to say to DoD communities because it's important. I don't want to sort of create the impression that I'm trivializing the incredible work that was done to keep people safe, but it is still the case that we have more terrorists today, more Islamist terrorists today than we did on 9/11, and that ISIS is sort of a consequence of the US war on terror in a lot of ways. And we want to be incredibly careful, I think, not to repeat that mistake. It would be an incredible error to, one of the major things that contributed to that was failing to differentiate between extremist voices and violent extremist actors. So that's one of the sort of major concerns I have. I will say that I have a couple other sort of, three other sort of concerns. One of the concerns I have is that I think that the Biden administration is in an incredibly difficult position right now because of a really difficult overlap between folks that are espousing these white supremacist violent ideologies and folks that are supporting former President Donald Trump. And it could incorrectly create the impression that the Biden administration, in targeting and acting aggressively against violent extremism, is engaged in political targeting. I don't think that's what the Biden administration would be intending to do, but I just think it creates a difficult environment for him to act in. And I think that how the sort of administration threads that needle will be interesting to see. But I do think that's a major concern right now, which is that anything that the Biden administration does that's perceived as a move against Trump supporters will be perceived as a political movement, even if it's a sort of nonpartisan anti-terrorist movement. And then the other two big things. I think later in this conversation we'll get to. One of them is social media. I have a lot of concerns about the role of social media, which didn't really exist in the same way when 9/11 happened. And I'm worried. There are a lot of conversations happening about how we've developed this incredibly robust toolkit over the past 20 years to sort of counter Islamist terrorism. And I think that's true. But I would argue that a lot of those tools aren't going to be particularly helpful in domestic environments. We were not especially concerned about the free speech rights of the Islamists whose websites we took down. We weren't particularly concerned about the civil liberties of folks that we bundled off into prisons. And while we made some incredibly sort of ethically and morally egregious decisions that I think we have come to terms with, so some of the torture practices that we engaged in come to mind as one example. I think we still place a lot of faith in some of those other sort of techniques that we used, and they're just not applicable in the domestic space. Mm-hmm. So I think we actually still need to build a pretty robust toolkit, because this is actually, I know there's a tension here. I started off by saying that this is the same problem, right? The sort of pathway to radicalization of violence is the same in both cases, but the operating environment is so fundamentally different that I'm not actually sure we're prepared in an as robust a way as we might like to be.
Eric, do you mind if I just jump in real quick to say, Meg, I think what you and I just said is very highly complimentary. I do want to go back, just because we're in this conversational dialogue, to say, I agree with your point that U.S. post 9/11 terrorist policy did create more terrorists, and that the ISIS is inherently a result of that policy. The point I would make earlier is the United States as a whole at home is certainly safer. And I think that that's allowing us this moment to focus on these issues a little bit more. But agree with your overall point, without a doubt. And maybe I'll pause there just to say, when we get into the conversation of online radicalization, I think that's going to be an interesting part of the conversation.
Great, thanks both for that. Hey, as we're sort of talking about what should we be concerned about, it's a natural transition to what we what should we be doing to counter DBE here? Let me just bring Bill into the conversation. There have been periods of time when folks have challenged the legitimacy of the government and its decision making, and there have been times in our past when that's turned into violence. There's been times in our past where that's been closely interwoven with terrorist acts. What perspectives do the past offer us on the kind of tools or kind of approaches we might take to addressing these challenges?
Thanks, Eric. Great question. Looking at the past now, in the government's campaigns, various campaigns against Ku Klux Klan, and also more recent terrorist groups and individuals. Actually, I think law enforcement has been, when it's had the will, has been remarkably effective. I mean, the post Oklahoma City crackdown on violent right-wing extremists was quite effective. Okay, the government used all kinds of tools, all perfectly legal. They went after people who were engaged in welfare fraud. They went after people who had illegal firearms. They did a lot to take some of the most dangerous actors off the stage. So, and even looking at things like, and another approach, which a lot less savory and gets to some of the issues that Tom and Meg brought up, the FBI, beginning in about 1964, was very motivated to go against the Klan. And the FBI did, in their counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, targeted so-called white hate groups. They infiltrated them, they had informants, they spread disinformation about them, they exposed sexual and financial peccadillos. A lot of that was probably illegal, but it turned out to be quite effective as well. But I think historically, looking at, while recognizing that they're not political crimes, but politics is absolutely interwoven. But seeing this as largely a law enforcement problem is one way forward. I mean, there are plenty of ways to prosecute people who are moving or have moved into violent extremism. But one of the problems has been, and there's really just anecdotal evidence, but we saw that on January 6th, something like scores of off-duty police officers who were part of the attack on the Capitol. If you have police who are actual members or sympathizers with violent right-wing extremism, the ability to investigate those crimes and to protect citizens is obviously radically compromised. But again, I think historically, looking at these activities as, to the extent they're criminal, as criminal, and not as thought crimes, has been the most effective domestically.
Yeah, I'll chime in and add to that. I think that I think the most important thing that we can do is to maintain a distinction between extremists and violent extremists. So I know that some on the far right and the sort of white supremacist circles, for example, have called for the creation of an NAACP for white people to sort of advance the interests of the white population. From an ideological, well, we know Eric sort of started at the beginning, so I find that morally abhorrent. I sort of think that sort of it's really missing the big picture in sort of conversations that are happening around structural racism and sort of opportunity that are happening in America. And I'm not sure that I find it counterproductive in an infinite number of ways. But that person is actually looking for the person advocating for an NAACP for white people is looking for a policy-oriented solution to the grievances of a population that feels that it's been marginalized. Now, whether or not that population has been marginalized, those are different conversations we could have. And certainly there's real meat in those conversations, right? Acknowledging structural racism faced by people of color doesn't mean denying the disadvantages that are faced by a large swath of the American population that is not of color. But I think what's going to be really difficult for Americans is to sort of find ways to support the guy who's calling for an NAACP for white people. And yet the thing I would really want to sort of foot stomp there is that that person is looking for a peaceful, nonviolent, legalistic, legislative, and policy-oriented solutions to sort of, like I said, addressing the grievances of a population. And while it's gonna, that's the kind of person that we should not sort of criminalize in these conversations, right? Sort of driving that person to violence isn't the solution here. No, that doesn't necessarily mean empowering that person or telling that person that they're right. But I do think that that's, you know, we sort of, it's very easy to sort of say broad things like we need to maintain the difference between extremism and violent extremism, but that becomes a lot more complicated when we acknowledge that that might mean not sort of demonizing the population calling for an NAACP for white people. That is what that extremism might look like, and that there are commendable things about that course of action insofar as it rejects violence as a path forward.
Thanks, Tom. From your experience at DHS and the framework for countering extremism and targeted violence, can you give us your perspective on some of the kind of helpful actions that could be brought to bear in order to counter the violence that comes out of these ideologies, and how should we be thinking about the toolkits available to the government at the state, national, local level?
Yeah, I'm more than happy to, Eric. I think that there's actually, what I would like our viewers, folks joining us today, to understand is that this has been thought about, and not to the extent that foreign terrorism has, but there are plans, there are approaches, there is significant time and resourcing put into this, although there certainly needs to be more. And so I'd happy to give some of those thoughts from previous work. Maybe the place I'll start is with Meg's point, which I think is incredibly poignant. I think that, to a comment made earlier, we run a risk in this moment when we talk about not a particular ideology, but anything across the DVE context, or any ideology across the spectrum, pardon me, we run a risk of, by focusing on ideologies, of, again, marginalizing moderation and enhancing polarization and extremism, which ultimately will only lead to more violence. And so that's the framework for a comment that this response that we need to take from a government perspective is actually a response that is and shapes a whole of society approach. And so, Eric, to your specific question, there's resourcing and leadership that can be done at a federal level, but a lot of this work needs to happen at a state and local level, and at a civic level, and even an individual level as well. So one other comment that I'd make, I'll build off of that to dive into a handful of things that we can certainly do. So first, we need to devote more resources to this problem set. We need to study it and better understand it, DVE writ large, and the largest and most lethal aspects of that, particularly racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism. We need to look aggressively at how we have dedicated resources towards this challenge relative towards foreign terrorism and other national security priorities, particularly as we realize that this is a growing threat relative to others for us here in this context. Secondly, this is a very tangible thing that we need to do. We need to fix intelligence sharing between the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security has a responsibility for building and enhancing prevention mechanisms. They have a responsibility for preventing acts of targeted violence and terrorism before they occur, primarily through advocating and promoting the capabilities of our state, local, and civic organizations. The Department of Justice has the responsibility in this case for the investigations and for prosecuting or going after attackers after they occur. There's an inherent structural issue between these two departments in that the Department of Justice does not share most of its tactical intelligence around this threat with the Department of Homeland Security. And they have legitimate reasons to be concerned about how and where to do that. Information sharing is a very complicated conversation in the federal government. But ultimately on the DHS side, that means that DHS is less informed than it needs to be of ongoing trends or upcoming trends, and particularly in this rapid radicalization environment, therefore less positioned or less effectively positioned for its prevention programs. So DHS and DOJ really need to get together and try to work on an information sharing and collaboration that supports both of their respective missions in this space. Another tangible thing that we can do is target foreign influence in the DVE space, because as I mentioned, earlier, DVE inherently, it comes from a US-based ideology, but the reality in our current moment in time is that many times this is being inflamed or fanned by foreign organizations, in some cases, arguably nation states or those affiliated closely with them. And we have the authorities, to Bill's point, we have the authorities, and because there's an international context here, some very powerful intelligence-related authorities to go after foreign individuals and foreign groups and adversaries that are meddling in our country in this way. And we should do that, and we should do it aggressively. And then finally, I'd say we need two things. We need to concentrate on TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures that everybody in the DVE and the larger CT space uses. And the biggest one there that I think we could probably talk about for quite some time is online radicalization. The Global Internet Forum for Countering Terrorism has done some really good work, a conglomeration of a number of major companies in this space, some tangible work to prevent attacks, to remove extremist and violent postings and propaganda. But we need to have a real conversation as a country, and probably at a larger global level, about the efficacy of private corporations censoring or censoring their own platforms, and their ability to do it effectively to prevent violence, which doesn't seem to have been the case if you look at the escalating rise in domestic violent extremism, and also the concern that many have that it's not done in a way that doesn't include political bias. And the challenge here is, if individuals think that their social media content, their engagement online is being moderated from a political perspective, they're going to go elsewhere. The middle is not going to be in the mainstream channels, or they'll be the only ones there, and the extremists will go elsewhere on both sides of the equation. And then ultimately what that does, to the point made a few minutes ago, is that further marginalizes moderation and increases the power of extremists to rapidly radicalize to violence. So those are a handful of things, and all of those can be addressed in many cases with additional funding. And there are some frameworks for that. I know DHS is working on updates. There was a framework put out in 2019 that you mentioned earlier. And I know the DOJ is working on this aggressively as well. But funding is going to be a major issue, and directed towards all those things just mentioned is a great way to start the conversation.
Excellent, great, thanks so much. I'm going to give Meg and Bill each a chance to weigh in on what they think we need to be doing, or what are the complexities that we're going to have to wrestle through to be effective. And then I want to move into the Q&A from the audience, because we have some great questions teeing up there, but I want to give first Meg and then Bill an opportunity to offer some ideas on either what we should do or what we need to come to understand and work through to effectively address these challenges. Meg?
Yeah, actually, well, I'll build on what Tom said, but before I do, someone pushed back in the chat against my use of the phrase morally abhorrent to describe an NAACP for white people. I think this is probably one of the disadvantages of a live unscripted event, but perhaps the advantage is that I can clarify. Probably wasn't the best language, and it came out maybe a little harsher than I might have if I had sort of written up remarks. I will say that I find it sort of morally abhorrent to advocate for positions that assert the supremacy of white culture. And I do think that, I don't think that's a particularly controversial sort of statement to make, and I would stand behind that. I don't find it morally abhorrent to advocate for one's community. I have some sort of, a discomfort with advocating for one's community when that community, when that sort of conversation is caught up in conversations of white supremacy. But I think, as the rest of my comments made clear, I actually commend sort of solutions that are legislative and policy oriented versus solutions that are violent. So with that sort of hopefully course correction aside, I'll pivot back to what Tom said. I think the answer here is sort of to kind of really emphasize what Tom said: local, and involves sort of a lot of civic engagement. I think one of the other so most of the research demonstrates that national governments don't have the sort of granularity on what is happening in the sort of towns and cities and communities and neighborhoods where these folks are radicalizing. And so we need to sort of empower local actors to sort of engage in programming and outreach that can kind of identify and sort of course correct these folks before they radicalize to violence. The other sort of piece here is I think this is a really interesting place where we're seeing a little bit of a structural shift. America's kind of first wave approach to counterterrorism was very military, right? It was very, we'll find the bad guy, we'll kill the bad guy. Our sort of second wave approach was very oriented towards law enforcement. It was all about detaining and prosecuting. And I think what we're seeing right now is a little bit of a more robust engagement with public health models, right? One of the real advantages here is if your child is radicalizing and you're concerned about that, if we're in the first model, you would call the military who might kill your child. In the second model, you're calling a law enforcement professional who might imprison your child. But in the third model, in public health models, you're calling a psychologist or social worker who might sort of do the outreach necessary. It's going to increase community reporting, which I think is fantastic. And I think those models for really dealing with this as a community problem, much like we treat gun violence as a community health, a public health problem, are really fruitful and one of the sort of most productive sort of paths forward.
Thanks, Meg. Bill, would you like to weigh in on this, and then we'll move
Sure. It's really a question for Meg and for Tom, and that's the whole de-radicalization issue. And I'm wondering, I don't know, reviewing the literature, looking at Europe, looking at our own efforts, I don't see a lot of there. I'm not sure when and I bring this up because I think this term is inevitably going to be brought in. What do we do to de-radicalize people, right? People who may or may not, most likely not, move into violent activism. I'm not sure we know how to de-radicalize people. I mean, this much vouted Saudi program where clerics were brought in to talk to jihadists and so on was a lot of smoke and mirrors. I don't think the British have been particularly good at it. The Nordic countries have devoted a lot of attention to this, but I'm just, wondering what your thoughts on this are, because this is inevitably going to come up, right? We want to prevent domestic violent extremism. The people who do that who carry out those acts are radicals. So therefore, we need, if we want to go to the left of the bang, God, sorry, war on terror metaphor, we need to talk about de-radicalization. I'm a skeptic about it.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it can't be done, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on either US or other government efforts to de-radicalize extremists.
I'll take a first run at that. I'll say that I don't think that the federal government is in a sort of position to successfully de-radicalize folks. Most of the research suggests that those sorts of initiatives are better, sources of authority are necessary to sort of help people change their positions about ideologically radical positions. And so former members of the groups are better voices in sort of compelling people to give up those ideologies, because those people are recognized authorities, while government officials aren't necessarily recognized authorities. So I'm not sure I have a ton of confidence in sort of a federal level program at engaged in that. I have more confidence in federal funding for that. I do think what we're better at is preventing the radicalization from happening in the first place. I think there's a lot more space there to be active and to sort of engage in the kind of outreach that would prevent this problem from escalating from extremist ideologies to violent actions.
Yeah, I'll echo that just briefly to say, to draw a distinction. There are hardened domestic violent extremists in the country today. They're in many countries across the world. And we need to take traditional law enforcement action aggressively against those groups and against those individuals. And I should say individuals, because the notion of groups in this context, it can be confusing. Some of the things we talked about earlier, intelligence sharing between departments, resourcing for the problem relative to others, those are immediate steps that we can take to do that. I think Bill makes a really good point, or Bill, the way you said, I think you make a really good point. The notion of off-ramping individuals is very, very challenging, and it's rife with civil liberties conversations and complications in the domestic context. But I'll go back to a point made earlier. Compared to foreign organizations and foreign terrorist ideologies, and the example is, you gave of the UK. In that context in particular, we're talking about traditionally foreign-based ideologies motivating attacks there in the UK. Because this issue is inherently domestic, we have more tools in the toolbox than we have had in other traditional terrorism contexts, in my opinion. And those tools aren't as tangible as traditionally. We're not using missiles. They're not as kinetic, but we do have civil engagement, academic engagement, mental health engagement, not to put that as the end solution like some do. When we have state and local and community-based engagement programs that Meg mentioned, which I think have real potential for efficacy here. And so I think Meg boiled it down really well. There's an opportunity for prevention through community engagement. The off-ramping, I agree with you, Bill, is going to be challenging. But one way that I think there's an interesting conversation to have about how we could potentially do that is in observing radicalization to violence in social media, and a conversation around the roles of social media companies in that context, and how those organizations in that context interact with state and local authorities to engage and hopefully prevent attacks. And we have seen examples of success, many examples of success in that space when we have applied the appropriate resources to off-ramping individuals. And I won't belabor the point, but to give a highlight and commendation to my former colleagues at DHS out in Denver, there's some great success stories of successfully off-ramping people before violence occurred, based on a heavy amount of engagement between schools, local community organizations, mental health organizations, and also law enforcement, but without law enforcement being the first response.
Thanks, Tom. There are a couple of questions that came in that get to the left of the boom concept that Bill raised, and we've been talking about a little. One of them is, so how and where should we draw the line in terms of surveillance and regulation of political speech, particularly in social media? And put it another way, where does prevention become pre-crime enforcement? Another question was that we received here was essentially, how do we think about the role of ideologues who avoid specific calls for violence but clearly incite violent extremists through coded language and emotional appeals? What can we do about those, and should civil society take the lead in marginalizing or confronting those voices? So let me tee up those two left of boom concepts that came in from the audience today.
You have some easier questions, Eric?
It's a great audience. It's a meaty subject. So Meg, I'm going to give you the chance to wrestle through sort of that opportunity. How do we think about radicalization and the line between developing radical ideas, stoking perhaps action and activities through coded language, and that break point between actually moving into extremism? How should we think about it? What are the pitfalls in addressing it the way we have traditionally addressed some of those challenges, and where are the opportunities for us?
Okay. So I think that one of the huge advantages we have here, and I'm not sure sort of practically how much of an advantage is, but we were rattling off sort of the things that we kind of have going for us in confronting this challenge. One of the big advantages we have here that we didn't have in the war on terror is that we understand that it's our culture. Right? So we recognize the dog whistles. We know what the coded language is. We're not sort of we're not foreigners to this conversation. We understand the contours of white supremacy in America. So I think one of the advantages we have is being able to identify that, which is something we really struggle to do in our sort of engagement with Muslim leaders across the world as we were sort of dealing with violent Islamism. I don't have great answers for how to sort of draw those lines. I more have concerns, I think, like everybody else, right? Which is to say, we don't want to get into the space of monitoring speech. And critically, we've had this problem before. So Michael Bray is a reverend in a sort of breakaway, a small, he was a part of the Lutheran religion and then broke away and formed his own church. And he wrote a book called The Time to Kill, that same title as the John Grisham book, but a very different book in which he made the argument, a sort of theological and ideological argument for why it was appropriate to kill providers at abortion clinics. And his book was cited by many, many people who engaged in anti-abortion violence during the 80s and early 90s, to include Scott Roeder, who killed Dr. George Tiller in 2009. So while we look in the sort of Islamist space and we say, you wrote a manifesto and we'll put you on our list of people to track down, it just doesn't happen. It just doesn't work the same way here. And I think to some degree, there's going to be an inherent amount of risk we're going to have to tolerate in order to protect the sort of free speech of Americans. I will say the two things I worry about in this space are, I think social media companies have far too much power right now. And I don't mean that in the sense that I think that power should be wrested from social media companies and given to the government. I think that's a pretty terrible idea. But even users don't have the power to control what's in their feed, and I think that's a real issue, right? Too much power has been given to an algorithm that is motivated exclusively by ensuring engagement. And I think I also really worry about deplatforming, right? And so on the one hand, I think sort of silencing some of these voices and muting them is probably a good thing. But on the other hand, if they're just going to go find another platform and sort of operate in an echo chamber where they can just sort of amplify one another, then there's no dissenting opinions. And I think I find that problematic as well.
Meg,
yeah,
please, pardon me. I just love to amplify your comment on platforms and just say the lack of ability to hold social media platforms liable for content is it's a conversation that's coming. And I know that's a big thing to say. And I know a lot of people would say, hey, just stay away from that one. It's got to happen. Liability is one of the only ways, to your point, for individuals to protect themselves and to say that what they're seeing is inappropriate or they've been harmed, and not allowing individuals, or basically preventing individuals from holding platforms accountable. It creates an environment that effectively, what I think we've seen is the continuation of extremism on these platforms.
Tom, while I have you on the mic, I have a question I want to ask you, or two questions coming in from the audience that I want to ask you. And then Bill, I'm going to ask you a question next in just a second. The two questions that I want to tee up for you, Tom, relate to the intelligence community and coordination across the government. One question we have is, what authorities is the intelligence community currently using to combat foreign influence by state actors within social media? And what do we think could be done legislatively to further this effort? So what's going on from outside the country? What do we do about it? And then another question we have is, how are the fusion centers fulfilling the role of creating that joint collaborative, concerted, combined effort between federal, state, local, and tribals governments? Are they properly resourced? Are they properly oriented to deal with DBE as opposed to terrorism?
Those are two great questions. And the latter is going to be a little more complicated, so I'll hit the former first. There's a lot. When an organization is foreign-based, the authorities differential between the domestic conversation that we're having today is significant. And I'll use an example of the Russian imperial movement, which was designated by the State Department in, I believe it was early spring 2020, it may have been 2019, and pardon me if I got to have the numbers wrong. What that does is that opens up a variety of capabilities, from financial analysis to other types of capabilities that the community writ large can use to target that organization. And as we look at foreign influence in the United States around these sorts of ideologies and violent activity associated with these ideologies, to be very clear, because those foreign groups, when they act, they are not U.S. citizens entitled to U.S. protections around First Amendment and effectively even hate speech. They are susceptible to a lot of the capability that we have brought to bear against traditional, use that term in quotes, foreign terrorist organizations in the past. And so we can follow money, we can target it in a different way. And frankly, that's something that we should be doing, I would argue, much more substantially. But to be very clear, again, this problem is not inherently foreign. It's shaped and inflamed from a foreign influence, but it is inherently domestic. And so we still have to wrestle with these jurisdictional issues and these liberties, civil liberties issues here at home. I hope that was somewhat constructive, and I'm happy to revisit it if it's not a perfect answer. On the fusion center side of the house, the fusion centers have a varying degree of success depending on where they're located. You know, candidly, some fusion centers are more successful than others. The degree to which they interact with their state and local environments is also different. The degree to which their resource can be different as well. And so that it's a broad swath for an important question. But one of the things that I would highlight in just my own personal opinion and experience goes back to that conversation about intelligence sharing between the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security has this primary responsibility, or one of its primary responsibilities, in the intelligence and analysis space, which is a subdivision of DHS or component of DHS, to share threat-based intelligence and even strategic intelligence with state and local law enforcement as appropriate. And the fusion centers play a major role in that, but they need to be appropriately informed of the threats that we were talking about. And we've been talking about this during this entire conversation, to figure out how to appropriately inform state and local law enforcement. And it's very dry, but ultimately a lot of this comes back to how well we share intelligence and how well we do cross-functional analysis, dual seal, tri-seal products, that sort of thing, that take into account the equities, not only of one bureaucratic organization based largely here in DC, at least at its headquarters, but also state and local law enforcement and their mechanisms and ability to respond. And one last thing to say, that comes in at the state and local level. If you're engaging state and local law enforcement, you're also going to inherently engage those state and local communities more aggressively, and you're going to empower them to get involved in a more healthy manner.
Thanks, I appreciate that. Bill, this one I'm going to push in your direction. It's kind of relevant to the conversation we're just having about how do we get after this problem, but it was a comment and question offered by one of our audience members. It says, perhaps DVE is more similar to the war on drugs than it is to the war on terror. How would you react to that, and how might you think about what we can learn from the war on drugs?
Well, we all know the great success of the war on drugs. So hopefully we won't go down that path. I mean, I guess I don't want to be all semantic about it, but it's again, it's the war analogy, which is sort of our default position when we're dealing with some apparently urgent threat, right? And it's probably not helpful. The war on drugs, which actually came out of really some of our experiences in Southeast Asia with counterinsurgency, strangely enough, I think has largely been a failure. I would not look to that, the war on drugs, which I believe President Richard Nixon declared in the early 1970s, really had many, like the war on terror, had many unintended negative consequences. The war on terror, I mean, the war on drugs probably created more drug users, stronger drug trafficking organizations, and really created more problems than it solved. So I would be really skeptical. And again, using any kind of war analogy, certainly in the domestic context. I mean, the war on drugs was partly domestic, but it had a huge international dimension. But I think using that war terminology, for the reasons my fellow panelists have talked about, in the domestic context is very dangerous at worst, and at best unhelpful.
Thanks, Bill. Another question from one of our audience members. It points to one of the challenges of dealing with this issue is the lines between political free speech and political ideologies and perspectives represented in the sort of democratic processes, and the challenge that sort of extremist ideologies can provoke violent action, gets into a very, very difficult and challenging position, place for us to walk through and maintain a sense of direction and clarity in our thinking. But one of the questions is, how do we think about and how might we tackle the fact that some of the ideas and ideologies that are associated with it, some of the violence we've seen recently, are represented in the institutions of governance by elected officials, by folks in government service, whether it's at the police, state, local level, or whether it's the national level. How might we sort of walk our way through thinking about these difficult issues, and what tools can be used to tackle that?
I'll not answer that one, or I'll sort of speak around that. We've said multiple times over the past hour that there's a really critical importance in differentiating between extremists and ideological extremists and violent extremists. And most of what we've talked about is sort of the critical need to have an appropriate, a sort of a non-confrontational, but sort of a appropriate response to dealing with a violent extremist, right? Now, that doesn't mean not confronting someone with a gun, but it does mean sort of forestalling radicalization towards the direction of violence. I think one of the things that it's really important to acknowledge is that radicalization happens in environments. In fact, with the exception of Ted Kaczynski, even lone wolf actors exist within communities. And often these days, those communities are online, right? So voices that are not necessarily advocating violence, but are sort of affirming inaccurate positions or extremist positions, are contributing to an environment that sort of facilitates that radicalization. That presents a real problem for Americans, right? Which is to say, on the one hand, it's really critical that we acknowledge that having voices of authority in the United States espouse positions that we might recognize as extremist or that we might characterize as radicalized is their right. And it is a sort of within our right sort of culturally to respond to that and sort of to do that with cultural responses and our own free speech. And yet still to acknowledge, I think it's important, it's silly not to acknowledge that creates an environment that is not necessarily conducive to de-radicalizing the sort of broader population. It's not helping, right? And it's silly to pretend that they're unrelated. I think a lot of the political commentary has been sort of very careful to separate those things, and I think that's right. But I think it's silly to pretend that they're unrelated. Public speech, to include coded public speech from recognized authorities that espouses radical positions or disinformation, certainly isn't helping us to grapple with what would have been an incredibly difficult challenge in the simplest of times. So yeah, I think it's a real worry. I just don't have an answer on what to do about it. I don't know.
Meg, Eric, I'd love to just piggyback on that because, as always, I find Meg's response very, very accurate and very important. If I summarize what I heard from Meg, it might be disconcerting, but the solution is worse than the disconcerting moment that we have. And we have tools in our political representation, our political processes to address the moment as it is. And I think that's really important, just to kind of put a foot stomp or a fine point on this issue. There is going to be, and there is a conversation, there is a movement right now, it's happening behind the scenes, of people who want to address this issue with a very, very hard hammer. And that's going to be proposed in new forms of domestic terrorism legislation. It's going to be proposed in a variety of conversations that for most people 10 to 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we would have thought of as civil liberties overreach aggressively. And the answer or the excuse for doing that is going to be because we can't take this risk. But what Meg has highlighted here is the reality in a democracy of the fact that free ideas come with risk, and we need to combat bad ideas aggressively. And we have the mechanism to do that. And I say all of that to say, when we've looked at this from a DHS perspective previously, the focus has been on state and local and community engagements for a reason, because community engagements, individual Americans becoming more cognizant of these issues and conversing about these issues in a nuanced way is how you ultimately get to a solution that puts this country in a better place.
Thanks, Tom. A quick question for you. Are there new actions DHS should be taking? You've talked about approach this with nuance, and you teed up some ideas. Are there particular programs or policies to counter the DBE threat that either DHS has thought about in the past and chosen not to, or that you would suggest they do? And then I'll open up to the other panelists. I've gotten a couple of questions that say, we spent a lot of time talking about sort of right-wing, violent extremists and white supremacists, but how does the panel feel about Antifa activities or anti-police violence demonstrations that turn into violent moments? So I'll tee up those two questions. We'll wrap up here in the next few minutes with one last question for all the panelists.
Sure. Thanks, Eric. So I'll try to be quick. So on the DHS side, one of the most important things that DHS is currently doing within its authorities is funding grant programs to prevent DBE. These started a number of years ago under the previous administration and had a different focus, a different ideological focus. The point of the program shouldn't be ideological. It should be on preventing radicalization to violence across ideologies. And in recent years, that's been the case. When we were at DHS in 2019, the acting secretary at the time, Kevin McAleen, made an out-of-cycle request, did some personal lobbying to increase the funding and continue the funding for those programs, which have had demonstrated success in de-radicalization. That's part of the successes in Denver that I mentioned earlier. And the current Secretary Mayorkas just announced that they're going to reprogram additional funding. I believe it may not technically be a reprogramming, but to continue to expand these sorts of grants for state, local, community, and academic institutions. It's an incredibly powerful way for DHS to support its SLTT community members. The other thing that DHS should be doing and has a plan to do if they're funded by Congress is to advance and expand its Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. And that office is the office that coordinates those grants. It's the office that managed those successful off-ramping programs in Denver. And it's an office that was really only created actually formally in April of 2019. And so getting that office up from just a handful of staff that it currently has, at least in the field, and getting them bodies and experts in this space across the country and all the federal geographic regions, allowing them to engage with the mental health, the academic, the law enforcement communities in those spaces. We've seen it have demonstrable success, and if we fund it appropriately, I think you'll see it have success in other parts of the country as well.
Eric, if I could tackle the Antifa question.
Yeah, if I could just ask you to hold for just a second, because I want to give everyone the last question they can think about while you're answering this question. The last question is, since this is a new and emergent field with growing interest, are there particular resources, readings, authors, places that people should look as they're trying to understand this issue? Or if they're going to become an analyst or a policymaker to help frame the context as this discussion unfolds. So I'll toss that to Tom and Meg and Bill for last remarks as we wrap up in about 5 minutes. But Bill, on the Antifa and the anti-police violence, I'll give the floor to you.
Yeah, I mean, there's been an attempt by some people to sort of come up with this idea that Antifa is somehow the equivalent. Or is a big a threat as the violent right-wing extremism, and I think that's absolutely risible. Yes, Antifa has engaged in violence. Yes, they've broken the law, usually property-related crimes for which they should be prosecuted. But Antifa, which actually began in Germany in the 1960s as a way to basically confront neo-Nazis. And I see Antifa as basically kind of an antibody that's there to confront particularly white supremacists. And so I don't think there's a parallel there. And I think it would be a bit of a distraction to worry too much about them. It's not to say that they haven't committed crimes, but nothing to the level of what the violent white supremacists and anti-government groups have done. And I'll point out the Anti-Defamation League had a report recently that said, and it was a 10-year period, something like 53 police officers have been murdered by anti-government or white supremacists, anti-government activists and white supremacists. So I think they're a bigger threat to law enforcement than that very loose movement known as Antifa is.
Thanks, Bill. As we reach the last couple of minutes here of this discussion, we've only got 3 or 4 minutes left. I clearly see that there's a lot more discussion, a lot more engagement on this topic, a lot more of hard, difficult issues to work through, and some choices to be made, and some discussions to be had. To help frame that, I will just go around the horn and ask for recommendations on things that people can read or think about, or resources they can turn to. And let me start with Meg.
Sure. So I think it's important to start by acknowledging that there probably will be some fantastic books out in the next 2 to 3 years, but I don't know that there are a ton out at the moment that really describe the current moment. I'm going to steal Bill's thunder here because I know he would want to recommend this book, but I think Kathleen Belew's book, Bring the War Home, I think it's called. It's BELEW. If we're sort of acknowledging that there's a really significant cultural component here, is a really fantastic history of white power in America. And it's also eminently readable. And I think it's a really wonderful book. And I think it really describes sort of the century-long trajectory that kind of culminates in this moment. And I don't think we're going to be able to meaningfully respond to this moment without acknowledging its cultural roots. So
Thanks,
I'll offer that one.
Okay.
Yes.
Tom, anything? Oh, sorry.
All right. Go ahead, Tom.
Tom, go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Eric.
It doesn't have to be a book. It can be other resources, whether it's policy documents or websites as well, just people to continue their own exploration of these topics.
Sure. And I'm going to give a total cop-out answer, and I'm going to say that Meg is entirely right. There is not a lot of good literature on this. And Bill's going to be able to point us to good historic literature. He's one of the best experts in that space. But in terms of how we respond to this current moment in time, the books are being written, or they're about to be written now. And so I would encourage people to aggressively follow the news, and to follow the news across spectrum of political leaning, but also looking at the acts of DVE as they occur across the country, and thinking through who, how, and why they're being committed. And I think that you'll start to see patterns that are emerging and people are starting to write about, but I couldn't even name one particular one that I'd strongly recommend in this current moment. I would just close with a note that I think that it's important for us all to keep in mind that DVE writ large is growing, that racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism is the most lethal element of that, and it's extremely disconcerting in that regard, but that we're living in a moment where rhetorics are hot and people are committing violence against or because of some of these ideologies faster and more aggressively than they should be, or than they have been in the past. And we all need to look at this context and take a deep breath and try to engage with nuance as we move forward.
Thanks, Tom. Bill?
Yeah, Meg, thank you for stealing my thunder. The Kathleen Belew book, I think, is the single best account of the origins of and development of violent the white power movement in the United States. It's without peer. She traces it really to disillusioned Vietnam War vets who came back and formulated certain ideas about betrayal. It's absolutely superb. I would recommend that. The other thing is, yes, there hasn't been a lot written, and this is sort of the sociology of social sciences. I think scholars traditionally have shied away from it as a kind of radioactive subject, as sort of, the ultimate form of deviancy, and who really wants to study that, right? There have been scholars Peter Simi and others who've written persuasively. But I think there's been this yeah, it was almost an aesthetic sort of revulsion when dealing with violent right-wing extremism that kept scholars away, and hopefully that's going to change.
Well, that's a great segue for me to thank the three panelists that join us today for weighing into these thorny, challenging, difficult, and sometimes polarizing or even radioactive issues. This is an important first step in the conversation. I'd like to thank all of them for joining us and sharing their thoughts freely in this environment. I also want to thank the folks who helped put together this National Security Seminar event today, Doug Jackson, Casey Strickland, Virginia Bennett, and Janine Andrikowski, who helped with this. And I'd like to thank everybody who participated in the conversation, who listened. I hope there are things you can take from this into your work life or into your own personal life that will be valuable to you as you watch the news and come to understand what's happening. And I'd also encourage you to stay connected to CNA, because we're going to continue to try to facilitate and foster this professional level discussion across communities on this and other issues of national security import to the nation. So thank you all for your participation. Thank you to the panelists and the folks who supported us. And I look forward to seeing you again soon at another CNA National Security Seminar event. Thank you all very much.